Today's submission explores the painful aftermath of a breakup through two distinct pieces: an essay reflecting on the human heart's capacity to rebuild, and a raw, lyrical poem expressing deep longing and regret.
So a key theme running through this material seems to be the duality of heartbreak, capturing both the objective reality of eventual healing and the subjective trap of immediate pain.
Yeah, it really does capture that full spectrum. The sharp contrast between the reflective prose and the desperate lyricism captures the full spectrum of heartbreak. But presenting them as isolated pieces creates a disjointed emotional experience for the reader.
It really is a bit of tonal whiplash, because we have this prose piece titled The Architecture of the Resilient Heart, and it focuses entirely on the after. It's, highly rational.
Very rational, yeah. It patiently explains how time softens the pain, how memories lose their sharp edges, and how we learn what we need for future, healthier connections. But then we switch over to the lyric Wings of Regret.
Right, and that one is trapped entirely in the during. It is desperate. The narrator is begging for forgiveness, feeling small, and just wishing the memories would fade away entirely.
Yeah, and the weakness here is that because they don't interact at all, the prose ends up feeling slightly detached. It reads almost, too clinically about the raw reality of the pain.
Totally. Meanwhile, the poem lacks the broader, mature perspective of the prose. You read them separately, and you are essentially asking the audience to switch between two completely different atmospheric pressures without any decompression time.
It's like the prose is looking back from the mountaintop, while the poem is still actively tumbling down the cliffside.
That is exactly what it feels like.
The reader is left wondering how the author actually got from that frantic free fall to the calm summit. The journey between those two states is just missing.
That's a great way to put it. So, for a suggestion, what if, instead of keeping them isolated, the author interwove the two voices to create a dynamic tension?
Oh, interesting.
You want to use the raw, unfiltered emotion of the lyrics to disrupt and ground the calm, philosophical tone of the prose. Frame them as a single cohesive journey from devastation to resilience.
So, structurally, like breaking them apart and letting them interrupt one another?
Exactly. If you integrate them, it transforms a simple side-by-side pairing into a genuine, real-time dialogue between the past self who is hurting and the present self who is healing.
I love that. And for some concrete examples, the writer could use verses from the poem as epigraphs, or even as sudden italicized interruptions right in the middle of the prose section.
Yeah, like intercutting the scenes in a movie.
Right. For instance, you take that deeply desperate lyric from the poem, "At night I pray that soon your face will fade away," and you place it directly before the prose paragraph discussing how, memories stop being so sharp and gradually make room for new things.
Oh, wow. I love the friction in that, because when you put that panicked lyric right next to the calm observation, it completely changes how we read the prose.
It really does.
The calm observation no longer feels like a clinical fact from a textbook. It feels like a hard-won realization. It feels like a life raft the narrator is building to survive the panic of the poem.
It forces the calm prose to answer directly to the desperate poem. Reading the submission in its current state feels a bit like looking at a calm architect's blueprint sitting on a desk right next to a house that is actively burning down.
Yes.
You can't help but ask, how is this blueprint going to acknowledge the fire? If we integrate the two pieces, the essay becomes the literal act of drafting the blueprint while the flames are still being put out.
That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered going even further with that integration, specifically using the poem's core confession as the actual inciting incident that the prose is trying to resolve.
What do you mean by that?
Well, right now, the prose speaks in somewhat universal terms. Like, everyone goes through a breakup, everyone feels like it's the end of the world, everyone eventually heals. But the poem holds a very specific, dark guilt. Right in the middle, the narrator says, "My weakness caused you pain."
Right, the self-indictment. It's the one moment where the narrator takes total responsibility.
Exactly. What if that specific weakness, that specific failure, is the very thing the prose is attempting to rebuild from? If the essay is fundamentally about learning what we need and forming healthier connection, that argument becomes immensely more powerful if the reader knows exactly what broke the previous connection.
Oh, that makes so much sense. The poem provides the wreckage, and the prose provides the reconstruction.
Bringing them together in that way
forces the rational voice to actually reckon with the guilt expressed in the lyrics, rather than just philosophizing broadly about how time heals all.
Precisely. If that structural labor, surveying the wreckage, figuring out what went wrong, is how we heal, it makes the specific damage deeply important. You can't fix a foundation if you don't know exactly what cracked it.
Right, which brings us to the second. Let's look closely at the section discussing the idea that something breaks inside that feels unfixable, but then the heart reveals its surprising flexibility. The essay offers a deeply comforting perspective on emotional recovery, yet its reliance on familiar maxims about time healing all wounds leaves its core message feeling a bit generalized.
It's a very soothing read, but as we know, when a piece of writing becomes too soothing, it can sometimes cross over into becoming a bit conventional. It stops challenging the reader.
Yeah, the weakness is that the prose relies heavily on expected, almost colloquial phrases to carry its profound emotional weight. The text notes that we change and we learn what we need, and implies that time simply does its thing, allowing us to eventually find a more accurate connection.
And here is the glaring disconnect for me. The title of the piece beautifully promises the architecture of the resilient heart. Yet once you get past the title, the actual text abandons this architectural metaphor entirely in favor of standard, passive, psychological observations about breakups.
It sets up an incredibly evocative visual premise in the headline and then immediately forgets about it in the body copy.
Like, why promises architecture if you're just going to give us standard therapies?
So the suggestion here is to lean heavily into those architectural and structural metaphors to describe the process of healing. By mapping the emotional recovery onto the physical act of building, you make the abstract concept of resilience feel tangible, original, and deeply aligned with the promise of your chosen title.
That completely changes the texture of the essay. Think about why this matters psychologically for the reader. Abstract concepts like resilience and healing are, notoriously difficult to visualize. They're invisible.
Right, they're just ideas.
But a building, a structure, we know exactly how those work. We know they require blueprints, they require raw materials, they require intense labor, and they require time.
Let's give some concrete examples of what that looks like on the page. Instead of simply saying the heart is flexible or that time makes the pain soften, describe the heart as having load-bearing walls that shift. Describe foundations that must settle after the earthquake of a breakup.
Yes, I love that. And when discussing the phase of meeting someone new from a more conscious place, frame it as building a new wing or designing a different structure entirely. One suited for the person we've become. That is so much more engaging than just flatly stating that we love differently or more maturely.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of the actual physical labor of reconstruction? Because the text currently asserts that the heart is merely flexible. But wait, if the text itself acknowledges that we change and that we have to learn new ways of connecting, then flexible is completely the wrong word.
Yeah, because flexibility implies a sort of passive bouncing back. Like a rubber band, right? You stretch a rubber band, you let it go, and it snaps right back to its original shape.
Exactly. But a broken heart doesn't return to its original shape. The person you are after a devastating breakup is not the exact same person you were before it.
Right.
Architecture isn't flexible, it's constructed. Framing this as active rebuilding rather than passive flexibility creates a much more empowering narrative for the reader.
It takes healing out of the hands of passive time and puts it into the active hands of the narrator.
Yes, it means you have to survey the damage. You have to clear the debris. You have to mix the mortar. If the text says, we learn what we need, translate that into architectural terms like, we learn where to reinforce the beams, or we learn not to build on a floodplain next time.
It demands labor from the narrator, and as a reader, that's so much more satisfying. It shows us the exhausting, deliberate work of moving on rather than just telling us that moving on happens eventually.
Totally. I mean, time heals all wounds is a cliche because it demands nothing of us. If time does all the work, why write an essay? The essay needs to be about the work we do while time is passing.
And it honors the title. If you're going to call it the architecture of the resilient heart, you have to show us the blueprints. You have to show us the scaffolding. Right now, the essay describes a natural healing process, like a scrape scabbing over. It needs to describe a chaotic, dusty construction site.
I love the idea of scaffolding because scaffolding is temporary, just like the acute phase of grief. It holds you up while the permanent structures are being repaired, and then eventually it's removed. That is a brilliant way to map the emotional journey onto physical material.
It also makes the end of the essay much more earned. When the author eventually writes that we find connections that are healthier and more stable, We'll actually believe it. We won't just take their word for it because we've spent the whole essay watching them mix the concrete and lay the bricks for that stability.
So true. Okay, so we've established how to make the prose metaphors more vivid, active, and structural. Let's pivot over to the lyrical poem to ensure its imagery carries that same precise heavy weight.
I can see what you're going for here. Let's see how we can strengthen this by looking at the specific confessions in Wings of Regret. The emotional vulnerability in the lyrics creates a profound sense of empathy, but the reliance on conventional poetic tropes limits the visceral impact of the narrator's specific regret.
Yeah, the weakness is that it's the difference between feeling sad because a song is playing in a minor key versus feeling gutted because the lyrics are directly articulating a pain you've actually experienced.
Right. The lyrics here heavily rely on generalized imagery. We see phrases like fall without my wings, make it rain, and see your face in my dreams. These are very broad strokes.
Very standard.
And the problem with broad strokes is that they obscure the most interesting, specific admission hidden right in the middle of the poem. The narrator confesses, "My weakness caused you pain, and this song's my sorry." That is the actual beating heart of the piece.
It absolutely is. That's the moment the listener leans in, because the narrator steps out from behind the poetry and takes raw culpability.
But it gets swallowed up by the rain and the wings. The suggestion here is that the writer needs to strip away those cliched metaphors and replace them with hyper-specific, grounded details that directly illustrate the weakness and the daily lived reality of the regret.
You want to pull the camera in closer, away from the sky, away from the weather, and into the living room where the actual breakup happened.
Let's give some concrete examples. Instead of writing, "I may have made it rain," the writer should specify the action. What was the rain? Was it a harsh word spoken in anger? Was it a betrayal? Was it a failure to show up when it mattered most?
Yeah, get specific.
Instead of fall without my wings, the writer could use a metaphor grounded in the physical reality of the relationship. In fact, they could even echo the architectural theme we just established for the prose.
Oh, that would be an incredible connective tissue between the two formats.
Imagine if, instead of falling without wings, the lyric was, "I pulled the pillar down," or "I left the heavy door unlocked." Suddenly, the poem is in direct conversation with the essay's theme of structural integrity.
Poem, potentially a song. Isn't the whole point of that format to be somewhat universal?
What do you mean?
Well, pop music, for instance, thrives on generalized lyrics, rain, wings, dreams, precisely so that any reader or listener can project their own specific breakup onto the song. If we make it too hyper-specific to the author's exact situation, do we risk alienating the audience?
That makes sense, but could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like specificity actually breeding more universality? This is one of the great paradoxes of writing. We think that by making something vague, we make it relatable to a wider group of people.
Right? That's the conventional wisdom.
But the human brain doesn't actually connect deeply with vague concepts. It connects with tangible sensory details.
The paradox of the specific. I love this concept.
Think about how memory and empathy work neurologically. We don't empathize with a concept. We empathize with an image. If you sing, "I made it rain," my brain has to do the heavy lifting of translating that metaphor into, "Oh, they mean they caused sadness."
Yeah, it's too abstract.
But if you sing, "I stared at my phone while you cried on the couch," my brain bypasses logic entirely. I feel a visceral reaction to the guilt, even if I've never been in that exact scenario. I recognize the texture of the failure.
That is so true. The universal emotion, regret, is transferred to the reader much more effectively through a highly specific vessel. If someone hears, "I left you waiting at the station," they might not have literally been left at a train station, but they instantly remember the cold, sinking feeling of abandonment.
Exactly. Finding the exact, unique detail of the narrator's specific weakness will paradoxically make readers relate to the crushing guilt much more than reading about falling without wings.
It comes down to trusting the audience. You don't have to leave the lyrics blank for the audience to color in. If you draw a highly detailed picture of your own ruin, the audience will recognize the shape of the rubble, because we've all been standing in our own ruins at some point.
And crucially, it forces the author to truly confront what they are apologizing for. "My weakness called you pain" is a great start. But what was the weakness?
Right. Was it cowardice? Was it ego? Was it an inability to compromise? Naming the specific weakness gives the poem an edge. It turns it from a generic lament into a genuine confession.
And when you pair that genuine, hyper-specific confession with the structural, active rebuilding we discussed in the prose section, you don't just have a submission about a breakup. You have a comprehensive, multi-dimensional thesis,
on destruction and reconstruction.
You really do. You map the entire geography of a heartbreak. It goes from being a story about one person feeling sad to a manual on how to survive the collapse of something you built.
So if we look at the big picture of what we've discussed in today's critique, it really comes down to moving from the abstract into the concrete. First, we're taking the prose and the poem and physically interweaving them. We want to contrast the objective, rational healing of the essay with the subjective, trapped pain of the lyrics, letting that frantic poem interrupt the calm prose to show how hard-won that healing actually is.
Right, and then within the prose itself, we're taking the title literally. We're trading those passive words like flexible and time heals for active architectural concepts like rebuilding and reinforcing foundations to make the abstract concept of resilience deeply tangible.
And finally, we're doing the exact same thing for the poem. We're upgrading the generalized imagery, the rain, the wings, into specific, grounded confessions of regret that illustrate the exact nature of the narrator's weakness. We're trusting the paradox of the specific to create a deeper, universal empathy.
So the actionable summary for the writer moving forward is to really get their hands dirty. Draft a new combined document where the poem physically interrupts the essay. Take one entire paragraph of the prose and rewrite it using strictly structural building terminology. See how it changes the psychological weight of the paragraph.
That's a great exercise.
And then comb through the poem, find two cliches, and replace them with hyper-specific memories from the actual relation.
We want to see the real wreckage so we can appreciate the real rebuilding. We would love to see how this submission evolves. We warmly invite you to implement these changes, play around with the architecture of your own writing, and submit the revised work back to the critique for another round of feedback.
Definitely.
Because at the end of the day, you don't want to leave your audience coughing in the dust of a demolished building, but you also can't just hand them a pristine blueprint and pretend the fire never happened. You have to show them the messy, exhausting labor of laying the very first brick in the ashes.